Welcome, everybody, to Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, the author of Writing That Gets Noticed, Find Your Voice, Become a Better Storyteller, Get Published, and it is now a course at NYU and an elective towards the journalism certificate. Every week, I speak with novelists, with authors, with writers of every niche to talk about their tips, their tricks, their strategies, and how the sauce is made, including creative advice. I'll talk about essays and articles and share my own experience from 3 decades of publishing. So join me every week and grow your business and build your craft with Freelance Writing Direct. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes, and follow along on Substack, where I share special clips for subscribers only at estelleserasmus.substack.com. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, and I'm so happy to say that Poets and Writers has named Writing That Gets Noticed as one of the best books for writers. So, yay. So today, I am so happy to have Joanna Rakoff, and I want to tell you a little bit about Joanna. She's the author of the best-selling novel, A Fortunate Age, winner of the Goldberg Prize and the Elle Readers Prize, and the best-selling memoir, My Salinger Year, which was adapted into a feature film starring Sigourney Weaver and Margaret Qualley. She has written for Oprah Daily, Vogue, the New York Times, and many other publications, and has taught at Columbia University, Brooklyn College, and Aspen Words. It's so great to have you here, Joanna.
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm really excited to talk about writing.
And we first connected at the AWP conference, where I had a panel on writing about parenting, and you had an off-site panel that was so fantastic about women who leave, and talking about that with Maggie Smith, who's been on the program, Kelly McMasters, who's been on the program, Rima Zaman, who I know, and it was just such a pleasure to meet you in person. And I'm so excited that you're doing this.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on.
So let's get into it. One of the reasons I loved reading your book was you write from the perspective of working in the outskirts of the city in 1996 in the literary world at an agency. And at the exact same time, I was in New York City working in the consumer women's magazines area with, I think at the time I was with American Woman magazine, and then I was the editor-in-chief of Woman's Own, and then launched Body by Jake with Hachette in 97. So we were in different circles, but could have maybe seen each other at a party here and there back in the day.
Totally. I didn't know that you came from that world. And I'm sure that we did, because I went to so many magazine parties, because as an assistant at this kind of prestigious literary agency, I would get invited to things all the time, like literary magazine things, but then also just like magazine parties. And it's funny thinking back on how the world has changed, but I'll just reminisce slightly about, do you remember the whole issue launch party, where especially literary magazines like the Paris Review or whatever, they would have a party for a new issue, but glossy magazines did it too, especially if it was a special issue, they'd have like a big party. And I don't feel like that really happens anymore, but it was so much fun. And it just was it's funny thinking back on how different that publishing and media world was.
It's so different. I mean, we had a launch party for Body by Jake, and it was at this, fancy restaurant in the city. And I don't remember, I wasn't with the really big publications. I was with smaller and more launch publications, but I certainly went to my share of media events. I remember getting invitations from morning till night, and being single and living in the city, and then living outside the city as well. And I just, I would have a lunch, I would have an event. I'd have people coming to my desk and giving me products, and just so much would be happening. And then you could have a dinner, and then you could meet with PR people, and it was just really, really fun. But I considered myself a pop culture vulture. I was pop culture. There was absolutely nothing literary about me, Joanna. That came much later in my career did I find a little bit, and I still don't think I'm completely literary, but I have a little bit of a literary edge to some of my writing. But it's definitely, it was an exciting world. And this is an exciting exposition into this world that you were in. So you had a job to deal with all the communications that were coming in to the authors, and particularly to Jerry Salinger, who, by the way, I would say if we surveyed most of the Gen Z out, I doubt any of them have ever read them. That doesn't mean that they wouldn't get a lot out of your memoir, but what do you think about all that?
That's a question that I'm posed pretty regularly, and I've been posed since the book came out, which is almost 10 years ago now, which is strange for me to think about. But it's funny because there were periods like when it really did seem like Gen Z. And at the time when it first came out, people were asking me about millennials because that was what everyone was talking about. But it seemed like, younger generations were not really reading Catcher in the Rye in the same way that ours did and previous generations had. I have seen a kind of turning of the tide, and I'm not sure what to trace it to. Like, I sometimes think, like, have there been TikToks about Catcher in the Rye? Like, it's certainly possible. Also, there's the whole kind of taboo surrounding Catcher in the Rye, meaning that it's been banned in a lot of places, which can make, for sort of progressive Gen Zers, it can make them really interested in a book if it's been banned and they're seeing that sort of, ultra right wing folks are like, no, this is dangerous. They're like, wait, I want to read that. So I definitely am seeing, I have 3 kids, and 2 of them are, I guess they're Gen Z, they're 19 and 15. And, they both have read Catcher in the Rye. And I saw with my son, the 19-year-old, that definitely some of his friends had, not, I wouldn't say all of them. It was, I feel like when we were kids, like growing up in the 80s, everyone read it. It was just ubiquitous. It was sort of, almost a rite of passage. But I am seeing that kids are kind of, I don't want to say they're turning back to it because that makes it sound like it's a cultural touchstone for them. And I don't think it's that, but I am seeing that kids are reading it more than they were actually, let's just say, like 5 to 10 years ago.
And I could see that, and especially with Book Talk or TikTok, because that has made the backlist king. And for such a long time, publishers were like, it's only frontlist, it's only frontlist. Well, TikTok turned that on its tail because people are referring to books that are decades old. And part of that whole idea of books that are banned, books that are, you're being told, no, you shouldn't. And of course, that gets any younger generation wanting to do the opposite. So that's a really good point. I love talking about form and structure. And it almost lends itself to the material because what you did was you answered letters, this archaic form, right? Letters, who knows that? But you did that. And what's so interesting to me, and I don't know if you've really thought about this that much, Joanna, I feel like the theme of ambition, your ambition, is running through the book. Do you feel that? Because, and I feel that it's shown through your relationship with Don,
Mhm.
your relationship with Hugh at the agency, who kind of gives you these opportunities, and the way that you're so like butter wouldn't melt in your mouth, you're the good girl, you're doing the right thing, but you are taking it upon yourself to answer these letters at some point and put your perspective in, which is a very, a few years ago kind of thing to do, or even when blogging started, or when, people were starting to assert their voices over traditional authority, let's just say. And so
Yeah.
maybe because I recognize ambition and I own it in myself and I want people to own it and not think it's a dirty word, like an editor once told me, "Oh, you're so ambitious." What are your thoughts on that and how that parlays through the book?
I'm so happy that you asked me that question. It's not one that I get asked a lot, but it is something that has been pointed out by readers in different ways, especially young female readers. Like there's a moment in the book that it's sort of just my thoughts, and I'm thinking about my then closest friend and her life moving in this very conventional direction. Like she's, we're just 23 at that point, and she's decided to get married, and she's moved to the suburbs and is really sort of prioritizing kind of like, let's just say, lifestyle things, like how easy it is to get groceries. And I am thinking about the fact that I can't even imagine prioritizing such things. And I essentially think to myself something that I truly did think to myself, and I still think about a lot, which is that I wanted to be, I use the word extraordinary. I think like I wanted to be extraordinary. I wanted to live an extraordinary life. And I meant this, as an artist, definitely, as a writer, but at the time I also was interested in making films and doing all sorts of things. But I also meant it in terms of my actual life. I wanted to travel everywhere. I wanted to learn languages. I wanted to sort of do everything. I wanted my life to become bigger rather than smaller. And so this definitely resonates with people. I get a lot of mail from young people who sort of relate to this, and also will talk to me about their fears and the ways in which they feel beholden to their families and that kind of thing. But I think part of what that was about is I, from the earliest years that I can imagine, felt this kind of pulsing ambition within me, this feeling that everyone around me was thinking about their lives in this kind of small, circumscribed way, just moving from kind of like this logistical thing to that logistical thing. And I mean, the kids around me too, there's the sort of scope of their mind seemed to be so small. And I felt that I needed to go beyond that. Even I remember feeling this way, even as a very little kid, that kids were talking about what they wanted to do with their lives. And they were saying, oh, I want to be like a fireman, or like, I want to be a policeman, or like, I want to be a mom. And I was thinking, I want to be an actor. I want to be in movies or on stage. I want to, like, I was sort of had these sort of big ambitions. Like I wanted to kind of be part, though I didn't have the words for it, I wanted to be like a part of the cultural conversation and kind of like enmeshed with it and leading it and changing it. And as a kid, that felt very not okay. I was born in the 70s. My childhood was, in the sort of late 70s and early 80s. And it really felt at that time that it was uncouth almost as a young woman to have ambition, that if you did, you had to kind of keep it to yourself. And or I just actually wrote an essay about this, that it was okay if your ambition was tied to your physical beauty, and was defined by that. So it was okay if you were like a beautiful young woman who was like, I want to be a model or a movie star, like that was seen as being okay. But anything else was not, and you were kind of seen as being deluded or egotistical. And there was no separating out like the idea of ego from the idea of ambition. And I think they're two really different things. Like it's one thing to be like a monster of ego or to be a narcissist. Like that's something really separate than wanting to do something great, you know?
Yes, yes. I love that. And I love that you took it upon yourself. And we see the evolution in the book of you as a professional woman, of you as a creative woman, of you as somebody who finds your own sense of value. And every time I read about your boyfriend or boyfriend stand-in, Don, I was like, he's not good enough for her. Why is she with him? I was so kind of angry with you, Joanna. I was like, and I was the dating diva back in the day. Like I gave dating advice, not that I always took it myself, but it was like he was just so not worthy of you, and I kept waiting. I kept making notes like, "Is he worthy of her yet? Treating her bad." And then there was one point, I think, that he identified something for you about what you were doing. Finally, an explanation of Don, I wrote on page 102. You wanted it the same thing, the life of a writer. I think that's what you identified with him, but he couldn't follow through, and you followed through. And I think you just continue doing it more and more. Okay, let's talk about the container that you use. So letters was part of your job, but you also use letters as kind of a container for the story as well as the seasons. Can you talk about how you made that decision?
Well, I always knew that the book was going to involve the letters, because the book actually came out originally of an essay that I wrote that was very focused on answering Salinger's fan mail. So, it was just an essay, and that was really, there was stuff about my life and me, but the focus of it was the fan letters. And so that essay came out a long, long time ago. Like, it wasn't that long after I left the agency. I was very young, so it felt like a long time, but in reality, it was like 6 years or something, which for writing memoirs, not. Now, I guess people are like, oh, I did this a year ago. It's fodder for a memoir. But at the time, memoir was thought of as something, a form in which you wrote about things that happened in the distant past and you would gain perspective on them. But so to me, writing this essay for a magazine about doing this, I felt like I was writing about something from when I was like a baby, even though I was still basically a baby. It got a lot of attention at the time, in part, I think just because it offered a window into Salinger and like the Salinger world. It kind of developed a life of its own, basically. And some years later, when Salinger died, I had already published a novel by that point. Salinger died, and people remembered that essay and asked me to write other essays on the occasion of his death and asked me to be on NPR shows and that kind of thing and talk about Salinger. And that whole spate of things led to BBC Radio 4 asking me to make a radio documentary about answering Salinger's fan letters. And I was working on my second novel at that point, but I was having a hard time. Honestly, it can be hard to write your second novel. I don't know, it can be hard in general, but my first one sort of sold in a big way that I did not expect. I was not led to believe that would happen. And it was published in a kind of big way. And I felt weird. And, I was struggling with my second novel. And I thought, okay, a documentary. I love radio. This sounds really fun. I'll do it. So I made the documentary, and there's, of course, a script for it. It was a 9-month process. And when the script was finalized, the BBC circulated it within the British publishing industry. And an editor asked if I wanted to develop it into a book. And I at first said no. And then eventually, I kept saying no. But eventually that editor talked to my agent, and my agent, who had been saying, no, don't do this, just carry on with your novel. It's going to get easier. She was convinced that this could be a book, that there was enough in there for a book. And there's more to the story, but basically that's how it came to be. And it was this editor's idea. And so the book came out of this essay and this documentary that were all really focused on the fan letters. And I think initially, when I conceived of the book, I thought that was going to be the real focus of it, the heart of the book. I recently reread my proposal because, for listeners, I'm sure you all know this, but just in case you're a new listener, nonfiction books are sold based on a proposal. Like, it's very unusual to write a whole memoir and then sell it. It happens. It definitely happens. But in general, if you're a kind of established writer in any way, you're going to write a proposal, sell it, and then write the book. So in the proposal itself, I say something to the effect of like, the fan letters will be the heart. And in retrospect, I think it was crucial for me to tell myself that, because it made it less about me and more about them and the dynamic with them, between myself and them, the dynamic between them and the idea of Salinger that they had. I think if I had been given the task of writing a book about being 24 years old, and living in New York and working in publishing, I would have been like, there is no story there, dude. I would have frozen. But because I was thinking it was about the letters, I was able
That
to write.
allowed you to put the rest of in. So
Yeah.
I always do a deep dive into an author, even if I know them, even if I've met them personally before they're on the show. And one of the things I saw is that you gave a quote somewhere saying that when you're writing memoir, the best thing to do and the thing that helped you is to write it as if it were a novel. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yes. And that is sort of like one of the central tenets of my life as a writer. Honestly, I have 2 office spaces at home. This is one of them. I swear there's a reason I'm telling you this. So anyone who's watching this can see there's not much in this space because I just moved into it. But in general, I'm working on a new memoir now that also has like journalistic components to it. But I still keep a little index card above my desk that's not yet hung up in this new space that says, this is a novel. And then below it is a second index card that says, you are a character. And then a third that says, everyone is a character. And the reason that I found this so important, and I just want to say, I'm sure that there are people, I know personally people who would not need this kind of game. It's a game that I'm playing with myself in a way, or it's just, I suppose it's a structure tool or device, calling it a novel. So there are people who have no trouble writing about their lives and carving a story out of them. And I'm not one of those people. I'm actually a very private person. And I find it hard to kind of even show my real self to close friends, honestly. And I tend to clam up under aggressive questioning. And my mom always used to say about me when I was little, Joanna keeps it close to the bone. And I think that that's very true. Sometimes I think maybe I'm a good memoirist because of that, because it allows me to figure out, I think so deeply about what I'm including in any piece of memoir, whether it be an essay or a book, because my default mode is to withhold. So generally I sit down to write, or I'm working on something, and there's this sort of period of unpacking things, of being like, wait, I'm not revealing the most important thing that's going to make this all make sense. So, okay, I have to reveal that, but then I can take away these other things that are actually just noise and they're not important, that were kind of like red herrings, that are things where I thought that I was revealing something important and I thought that I was being transparent and confessional, and I was not. That was a sort of smoke screen. And now here's the really important thing. So basically, the larger point is that with my Salinger year, I signed this contract and then basically vomited. Like, I actually did throw up for real. It turned out that I had the norovirus and I had food poisoning, but I did, it seems like a perfect metaphor. I was like, I can't do this. I'm a novelist. I can't write a book about myself. I don't think there's a book here. I don't know how I'm going to do this. I don't want to examine myself. I don't want to reveal things. They're very hard things that are going to come out in this book, and I'm scared of them. And I was embarrassed by that relationship with Don. I was embarrassed by, there's another relationship in the book. Well, there's the one with my friend, Jenny, because that friendship broke up and she was a person I loved dearly. And I was embarrassed by the way I treated her, which I still feel was unfair and immature. And I was embarrassed by this other relationship with the person I call my college boyfriend, because I knew that I had treated him really badly, and I still loved him. And I knew that in order to write this book in a compelling and urgent way, I was going to have to talk about these people and these things. And so I had a year, like a full year, in which I did write, like I probably wrote 100 pages, where I was trying to figure out, like, what is my entry point to the book? Who are the characters? Because you have to figure out which characters to include. Everyone has a ton of friends and family. And, I was really doing background writing. Like, I included a little bit of that year's work in the actual book, but there was something holding me back, and I wasn't sure what it was. And I eventually came to realize that I felt that I was betraying all of these characters and myself in writing about them. Like, as a, I had written a lot of profiles as a journalist, and you probably have too. And there's this moment as a journalist where, you've done all this research, you've interviewed this person a million times, then you sit down to write. And no matter what you write, that profile is a betrayal of them, because you're presenting your take on that person. So even if you're like, Estelle is the most beautiful woman I've ever seen in my life and the most brilliant woman, like, it still feels strange to the person reading, who's being written about, because it's someone else's take on them. And so I came to realize this. And it was when I realized this that everything kind of fell into place. And I did have to write it down for myself on this index card and pin it up above my desk. And that allowed me to write with the kind of authority and, almost like, this is like really an exaggeration or an overstatement, but the kind of cold-bloodedness that you need to write memoir. You have to not be afraid of what the people you're writing about are going to think. And for a lot of people, that's very hard. And it leads to a lot of mediocre memoirs, or memoirs that feel disingenuous, that might have something compelling about them, but they feel disingenuous. I had read a lot of those and I didn't want to write one. And so there's one other component of this too, though, which is that I think there's a fallacy about memoir, which is that it's almost journal-like and you're just kind of narrating events. And that's not memoir. Memoir is an art form. And to me, you are carving out a novelistic arc from things that really happened. And so it can be hard to do that, because you think, wait, but I have to explain this in order to explain this. And if I don't explain this, then this person's going to be upset. And I need to, and I need to have all these people and blah, blah, blah. But if you really want to write a great memoir, if that's really your goal, you have to get rid of that noise and you have to just write it in a novelistic way. You have to break down characters. You have to, have a kind of rise and fall. You have to have scenes. You read a lot of not good memoir that doesn't have scenes. It's just a person's thoughts. You have to have characters. So a lot of not good memoir, the only real character is the narrator, and no one else becomes a three-dimensional character. And, in a novel, every character has a motivation, right? And they have a way of speaking, and they have their, an appearance. And in memoirs, often the other characters are just there to give you information about the narrator. And so I needed that sign that everyone is a character and you are a character, to remind me that I had to choose my characters well, and they had to be real, full-fledged characters, not just props to sort of show what I was thinking or illustrate something about me.
That's brilliant. That's sort of, in a way, taking the me out of the memoir and making it, it's not memoir, it's, the novel. So Hugh is a fully fleshed out character. Jenny is a character. Your boss and the agency is a character. It's not just to highlight you, but yet, and there are also themes running through. Like, for example, your dad said something on page 27 that really struck me. He said, everyone said my dad doesn't get to have exactly what they want. And I thought was that a conscious, I mean, obviously everything is a conscious choice, what you're going to include, but it's almost like, even your boss, I mean, she had so much power, but she didn't end up having exactly what she wanted. And Hugh, who was the original writer dude, didn't have what he wanted. And then when you thought you had what you wanted, I'm not going to give the whole book away, because if people haven't read it, I mean, they need to. But I would say that felt to me like a through line.
Yes, it's so true. And I hope this isn't a weird thing to talk about, but my Salinger year was adapted into a film, and I collaborated on the screenplay with the director. And ultimately, I sort of did like the final kind of rewrite of it. And there was a kind of scene that we kept taking in and out that was based on something that really happened, in which I had a really awkward dinner with Mary Gateskill, who I'm sure a lot of your listeners know and love. She wrote the iconic short story collection Bad Behavior, which was huge. She was a huge, huge writer at the time, and she's written many fantastic novels and a great collection of essays as well. And she's still like a respected figure, but at the time she was kind of like let's just say like a literary it girl. And so I accompanied one of the agents at the agency to a reading she did. And she came and joined us for dinner, and she was, really not nice to me. And I was shocked because I was so excited to meet her. And I don't know what I thought. I was very naive. Like, I think I thought she would like be my friend, or I don't know, or just like be nice to me or be interested in who I was. And she was very kind of chilly and was just like, who is this child at the table? So we had a scene. Point is that we had a scene that was sort of based on that. And the director had actually written it, not me. And Mary Gateskill would not allow the film to portray her. You have to sort of get permission to portray a real person in a film or a TV show, and she would not allow them to. So the director said to me, what other writers did you love at the time? Let's just choose a writer who people will still recognize their name today, but who you truly loved at the time. And I said, Rachel Cusk. And because it's true, she was not as massively famous when I was writing the script as she is now, but she was well known, definitely. And I had absolutely like worshipped her during that year that I worked at the agency. She had one book out at that time that I loved called Saving Agnes. So she gave permission. She was really nice, actually. And I wrote a scene. It's the only scene in the film that is 100% fiction. And this was right before we were going into production, and I wrote it. And so my long story is all to tell you that the director said to me, we want to see your character in a situation where she feels kind of flustered and embarrassed, and we see her not being her confident self, and we see her in the face of a real writer, but we want that writer to kind of teach her something about what it means to be a writer, something different than the stuff that Salinger says. And I think he wanted this because of things outside the book, like kind of like my life and also thoughts in the book about writing. He wanted to kind of dramatize them. So I ended up writing this scene in which Rachel Cusk says to the me character, to write a novel, you have to want it more than anything else in your life. Anything else, you have to want it more than pretty dresses. You have to want it more than parties. You have to want it more than boyfriends. You have to want it more than anything. And my character is like, oh my God. And that is what kind of sends her into making some different life choices. And so this whole very long anecdote is all to say that this is something, that I truly believe and that I have said. So I was kind of making Rachel Cusk give me my own advice, but I have said this to so many students, and yet it's something that I think as an adult can be hard to wrestle with as a bona fide grown-up who has, children, a partner, a mortgage, like real life considerations. Maybe you want to write that book more than anything else, but maybe for real, Estelle, like maybe like you're getting older and you're feeling worried about like how you look or whatever. And you're gonna, maybe that for like one day is gonna take precedence, like you're gonna get your hair done or whatever it is. Like it can be hard to have that be the most important thing. And I think I might have written that scene in part to remind myself of it at that moment.
I love that, like a little motivator for yourself for future
Yeah, for
Joanna as
future me, I
well.
just need to rewatch the film and be told that again and again. But so many writers who have watched the film have said to me like, oh, that was my favorite scene. I loved that. And I was just at Yaddo on a residency, and a writer there, a slightly younger writer, watched it while we were there and said like, oh, I loved that moment. I needed to be reminded of that. And I was like, oh. And
That is a beautiful segue, because I was going to say the sentence that you said to me, I've been at Yaddo. I've been busy working on my next memoir. I think it's called The Fifth Passenger. Am I correct? Okay. And, those are sentences that any writer would love to say. And it's beautiful that you said. So tell me a couple of things. One is, yes, 10 years later, you're working on a new memoir. So excavating all those emotions, and this is not about, it's not connected to a famous person, I believe, from what I've read about it. It's all about you, your background, things that happened before you were born, and as much as you want to say about it, you can say. And I wanted to ask you, because we're both journalists as our background, how does the research element work? I mean, how did it work for my Salinger year? Because obviously you had to research the letters or remember, or maybe I don't know, you probably have copies. It was the copy machine and there was no snapshotting on a phone. But how is the research process working for you? Because a lot of people, when they're working on memoir, they are using those tools and techniques and skills to build the body of research that's going to support the writing that they're doing.
yes, it's so funny. I was literally just rambling on to my husband about exactly this yesterday. So I think that another fallacy about memoir is that it's all sort of like there, or maybe you're going to maybe you have your journals from whatever era and you're going to read them and it's going to completely bring you back. But I feel like any memoir that I've read and really loved, it's turned out that the writer did as much research as you would do for like writing a book of history, or like, okay, that's an exaggeration, but like close to it, or like a novel set in the Middle Ages. And for my Salinger year, during that year or so that I mentioned, when I was writing, but the stuff I was writing, I knew was not the actual book, like it just wasn't working. I also spent that whole year. In fact, actually, it was more than a year. It was about 15 months researching this book. So I read quite literally everything available on Salinger, from like his official biography, any letters that were available. Right around the time that I was writing the book, the Pierpont Morgan Library got a cache of his letters. I read those, and it was really lucky to be able to see them. Of course, reread his work a bunch of times. I did have some of the fan letters, so I of course read those, but it takes 5 minutes. Again, maybe because of having a journalism background, part of what I wanted was to hear from other people who had kind of lived through this with me and hear their perspective on it. I was curious about the way memory works. A little side note is that when the memoir started to become the dominant form of our time in the 90s, when like Mary Karr's The Liars Club came out and that kind of thing, I really had trouble reading some of those early, hugely popular memoirs, because they would be, when I was 4, I was on the front porch with my dad, and there'd be all this dialogue from when this person was 4. And I'd be thinking, what? I remember a lot from when I was 4. Could I recreate dialogue? Probably, but it wouldn't be exactly real. And so I had trouble making this leap, whatever you would call like a kind of leap of faith. And I was concerned about doing the same thing in my own book. And I just wanted to see how my memories of everything from the physical office I was writing about, to what people wore at that time, to how people perceived me, to all sorts of things. I just wanted to hear about life then from people I knew then. So I interviewed a ton of people that I worked with at the time, and they told me all sorts of amazing things, from really big things that I hadn't known about that were happening in the agency, to really tiny things. I interviewed a person who was an assistant at the same time as me, who now is a really important agent named Jen Carlson, who represents some great writers. And she said, you know what I remember? I remember the spindles. I kept a couple of them on my desk. And I said, the spindles? What are you talking about? I was thinking a spindle was something on like a sewing machine. I was like, what? And she told me this whole sort of long story that I won't recount for you, but basically the the agency was so archaic, it was not computerized. And we had these metal cases that had these cards in them that were kind of like giant index cards with a fold down the middle. So like imagine this as an index card. Those cards were for magazine submissions. And when you were sending out a short story or a pitch or something to a magazine, you would make a card for it and put it in this case with a spindle down the middle. And these had to be from like the 20s. I don't think anyone in New York or the world used anything like this at that point. And so Jen was saying like, oh, I remember those. And she remembered this detail because it was so archaic. And the minute she explained it, I was like, oh my God, because those were actually on my desk. And so I interviewed people, I taped all the interviews, I typed them up. Like it was so helpful in terms of building the world in there. I couldn't have written this book without doing that research. The book that I'm working on now, it does require a lot of research because part of the story is about me uncovering a mystery in my family. And so it's meant that I've interviewed a large number of people. I still have people I need to interview. And also that I've done like archival research and research in court files and police stations and newspaper archives and that kind of thing. So it's much more personal. Like I'm interviewing people who were personally affected by this kind of tragedy in the town that I'm from. And it's very emotional and intense interviewing them. People start crying. People sometimes get angry at me. People are worried that I'm misrepresenting things, worried they get angry at other people saying like, oh, this person told you the wrong thing. That's not really what happened. There are contradictory interpretations of things, contradictory ideas of what happened. And all of that is really important. And with my Salinger year, there was that too. There were people telling me contradictory things about people at the agency, what was going on at the agency. I think that research allows you to write with the authority that you need to in a memoir, to have that memoir be really compelling. Like when I think about my favorite memoirs, they have an incredibly authoritative voice to them, narrative voice. And I don't know about all of them, but those that I do know about, there was research involved. There definitely was in terms of imagining one's way back into that world.
Is there some actionable tips that you can share that obviously work for you on how to tell a compelling story, or, from the sentence level to the bigger level? Was something that you can share, because you're a writing teacher and I love talking to other writing teachers.
What I'm trying to do is to speak to issues that I've seen in teaching, and also I get a lot of writers asking me for advice in general, on Instagram, that kind of thing. I think maybe because I wrote a memoir that's about writing, people ask me for advice. So, okay, here's a bunch of actionable things that are all pretty brief. I would say one is get a lockbox for your phone, because it is hard to write with urgency and dive off a cliff into a world. So if you're writing memoir, if you're writing a novel, whatever you are writing, let's even say you're like a film critic, whatever you are creating a world. And in order for that world to have the sort of texture and vibrancy that you want it to, you have to dive off a cliff. You have to lose yourself in that world. You have to be like shaky, with excitement, because you're so in that world. And it's very hard to do that with your phone near you. There's a lot of kind of people blaming themselves and being like, oh, I'm addicted to my phone or whatever. It's not anyone's fault. Everyone feels this way. Imagine locking your phone away for half an hour. You have no access to it. I think a lot of people feel scared. Like I know my husband and my teenage children would feel scared. So that's actually a good thing, to feel scared when you sit down and write. So for me, having a lockbox for my phone has made me really, really productive and allowed me to write some of my best work. You can buy a lockbox on Amazon for like about $40 or $50. I think it's called a kitchen safe is the kind that I use. Highly recommend. I also use an internet blocking piece of software on my phone and my laptop. I use a program called Freedom, which is very, very popular. So I'll just tell you a tiny anecdote, which is that when I was writing A Fortunate Age, my first book, it also required a lot of research. And I worked in a shared writer space. And this was so long ago that I could say to them, I don't want the Wi-Fi password. Don't give it to me. And I didn't have Wi-Fi in the space. Now it's really hard to do that.
Yeah.
But I would keep a legal pad next to my laptop. And when something came up, like a question, something I wanted to look up, I would write it down on the legal pad. And then at the end of the day, I would allow myself a chunk of time. I think it was even just half an hour to look everything up before I had to go home and pick up my kids and do whatever. So I highly recommend doing that as well, like taking yourself offline. I actually write a lot longhand, but if you're writing like most normal people on your laptop, keep handwriting tools next to your laptop, go offline, write down your questions. It's going to change the way you work.
So you write longhand. This is interesting. So you just take a yellow legal pad or?
Yep.
Wow.
I have
Okay.
hundreds of them. And that was actually going to be my next tip is write longhand. And I don't mean keep a journal. Like I'm actually not a huge journal keeper, especially since having kids. I feel like actually it takes away from the energy I need to write things for other people to read. And so it's not the best for me. It can help. I do it sometimes, but I don't feel like you need to keep a journal every day unless you want to. If you do, that's awesome.
What do you feel writing longhand does for you that is the opposite to writing on the computer? Because I haven't tried that yet. I really haven't, and I want to.
So I think it does a bunch of things. Our computers are now not just word processing devices, which when I was in college, that's kind of what it was, you know? And then
Yeah.
it became an email, an internet device, and that was hard in its own way. But now it's a portal to everything. Now you open it up and I could watch Career Enthusiasm, it's just a portal to all these things like texting, incoming everything. And even if you run a program like Freedom, or by the way, another good one is called Opal. If you run a kind of internet blocking program, there's a way in which psychologically, when you open your laptop, it means many different things to you. But when you take out a legal pad and a pen, and I just want to add here, these do not have to be fancy. In fact, it's better if they're not. You don't need like a special fountain pen or whatever.
Now,
But
what about an actual writing tip?
one thing that I would suggest, which comes out of teaching, is, and it's sort of like two-part. It is possible you out there are writing something in the present tense. And I'm just going to say that you should put it in the past tense. Stop writing in the present tense. It can work. Like there are a few books out there that are written in the present tense that are great. Like one of them is Jamie Attenberg's novel, All Grown Up. That's just the first one that comes to mind. I have read books in the present tense that are great. Maggie O'Farrell's Hamnet. Like it can work. But especially if you're writing a memoir, no, do not put it in the present tense. Put it in the past tense. It happened in the past. It's not happening now. And the present tense flattens your language. People seem to think that the present tense makes things more immediate, but it does not. It does the opposite. It limits the language that you can use in terms of experience description. It limits the tonal subtleties that you can employ. It limits your narrative technique. And there's a reason that those two novels I mentioned are novels from very, very seasoned writers. And they're not their first novels. I think that present tense, there's a way in which people think that they have to write in it. They think that that's what people want. They also think that it makes their work more vivid. And it actually does the opposite. And I would just say, like, if you're writing in present tense, switch it to the past tense. I would also say, if you're writing a novel, think really, really consciously and intentionally about your narrator. A big mistake that I see are fiction writers not thinking about their narrator as a character, as in, like, if you have a first person narrator, that it's probably a character. If you have a third person narrator, you might just be thinking, oh, I'm just saying what happened, I'm just writing about what happened. But the narrator is a character, even if you don't name that character, and I would say, like, consider reading books that really play with this idea of the narrator as character. Like a favorite of mine is Rufi Thorpe's The Girls from Corona del Mar. Another is Jennifer Haig's novel Faith. They really play with, like, who is the narrator, and they make you think consciously about the narrator. And I think it's going to unlock something for you. And if your novel is in the first person, consider whether it needs to be, and maybe play with writing it in the third person. And you might go back to the first, but it needs to be a conscious choice. And that's the biggest pitfall I see with beginning fiction writers, that they just start writing in the first person because they think it's easier or whatever, or they think it has to be. They're not making a choice, they're just doing it. And every single thing in anything you're writing, even if it's like 100-word like review of this water bottle, every single thing has to be a choice. It has to be a conscious choice.
I agree, even to the sentence level. Like sometimes and I talk about in writing that gets noticed, so you can end a sentence with a word that then leads into the next word of the next sentence. And that's much more powerful than ending in one place. Like if you're talking about, she was arrested, then the next sentence could start, the cop said, rather than she was arrested. When she got to the office the next day, the cop said, that
yes,
it's a
yes,
big
that
difference.
is such good guidance. Yes, I completely agree.
This has been such a fantastic conversation. We have covered so much. I thank you so much for being my guest.
Oh my gosh, thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
Follow me at EstelleSErasmus.com on my website and on social media, which is Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Estelle S. Erasmus. And we're now on YouTube for Freelance Writing Direct. Follow along, and soon everyone will be reading what you're writing.